High-pressure professional environments generate constant psychological friction. In crowded trauma wards and on high-stakes trading floors, the sheer volume of environmental demands accelerates the rate of occupational burnout. Yet, facing the exact same cognitive load, a divergence occurs. One individual collapses under severe pressure, while another, in the same environment, maintains active, proactive engagement. Historically, philosophers separated passion from reason, viewing emotion as a destabilizing force. But early theorists, dating back to Aristotle, hinted at a different mechanism, a calculative faculty of emotion. This intersection of cognition and emotion is now defined as emotional intelligence. The modern scientific challenge lies in measurement. Researchers remain divided between treating emotional intelligence as an objective cognitive ability, measured through standardized tasks, or as a subjective matrix of personality traits. Defining this construct with mathematical precision is a strict requirement for determining whether psychological resilience is a static, innate trait or a measurable systemic buffer. The ability model treats emotional intelligence as a standard cognitive intelligence. It relies on objective performance tests to evaluate an individual's capacity to perceive, use, understand, and manage emotions. Conversely, mixed or trait models, widely popularized by researchers like Daniel Ullman, rely on self-report surveys. These frameworks combine perceived emotional abilities with broader personality characteristics, such as optimism and stress tolerance. Self-reporting introduces methodological vulnerabilities. Subjects frequently skew responses towards social desirability, and these models often fail to isolate emotional intelligence from standard personality tests. To achieve higher precision, researchers utilize the Trait Emotional Intelligence, or TEI, framework. This isolates emotional dispositions into 4 measurable domains: emotionality, well-being, self-control, and sociability. This framework allows us to investigate a specific mechanism, how these 4 domains alter an individual's response to environmental pressure. Resolving the debate requires moving past abstract definitions to the structural equation modeling of hard occupational data. To map this mechanism, researchers tracked undergraduate language learners at Waseda University, an environment characterized by significant systemic academic stress. They employed a structural equation model. This diagram maps the statistical sequence of how different psychological variables interact. We begin with the negative outcome, burnout. This node consists of 3 measured subcomponents: exhaustion, cynicism, and a sense of inadequacy. On the opposite side sits trait EI. This functions as the independent upstream variable, the baseline profile the individual brings into the environment. Positioned between them is academic stress. This is the mediating variable, the active pressure testing the individual's traits. Finally, we have the positive outcome, engagement. This is divided into 4 active dimensions: behavioral, emotional, cognitive, and agentic. Mapping the exact architectural sequence of how these variables trigger one another is the key to preventing systemic collapse. This diagram plots the primary vector of occupational collapse, the path from academic stress directly to burnout. The statistical output reveals a path coefficient of 0.76. This high value indicates that stress is the primary predictive engine fueling the burnout cycle. We then test the assumption that emotional intelligence directly reduces exhaustion by mapping a pathway from trait EI straight to burnout. This relationship is statistically insignificant, yielding a negative 0.06 coefficient. High TEI does not directly suppress burnout symptoms once initiated. The true mechanism lies in the structural mediator. We map a new pathway connecting trait EI to academic stress. Here, the coefficient is negative 0.52. This proves high trait emotional intelligence severely downregulates the perception of stress itself. Simultaneously, the pathway from trait EI to engagement yields a positive predictive effect of 0.42. Trait emotional intelligence protects individuals by neutralizing stress at the source. It starves the burnout cycle of its fuel before the system can ignite. To verify this model, researchers shifted to longitudinal tracking, following individuals over a full academic semester. This graph shows a cluster analysis comparing 2 distinct participant profiles, looking specifically at exhaustion levels plotted over time. For the low trait EI cluster, exhaustion increases significantly as the semester progresses. However, for the high trait EI cluster, exhaustion levels remain completely stable. They face the same environmental timeline, yet the exhaustion does not accumulate. Over this same timeframe, the high TEI group reported a corresponding drop in feelings of inadequacy. Simultaneously, they exhibited a rise in both emotional and agentic engagement, the proactive manipulation of the environment to secure support. Longitudinal data establishes high-trait emotional intelligence as an active compounding mechanism for sustaining momentum. We can scale this mechanism from academic data to a macro-analysis of 112,000 healthcare professionals operating within stressful, high-demand systems. These radar charts map the non-cognitive trait clustering found across different medical fields, demonstrating how specific professions select for specific psychological architectures. The nursing population exhibits elevated emotional intelligence alongside peaks in likability and ambition. Occupational therapists and allied health workers present with strong sensing perceiving and intuitive feeling traits. These stable professional profiles correlate with the absolute necessity of managing high vulnerability to burnout. In these populations, the continuous execution of the TEI stress buffering pathway is a mandatory survival mechanism. Occupational survival at a systemic level relies on populations that self-select for the structural emotional architecture proven in the SEM model. Returning to our fully mapped structural equation model isolates the final architectural implications. The model reveals two diverging pathways, one leading to occupational collapse and the other towards sustained agentic engagement. Burnout is a conditional outcome, dependent on the strength of the mediating buffer, rather than an inevitable consequence of pressure. Emotional intelligence contains malleable components that yield to active training and reinforcement. Targeted interventions focus on building specific skills, like emotion differentiation and the downregulation of stress responses. Deliberately modifying these abilities alters a subject's operational path coefficients over time, shifting their trajectory away from exhaustion. Institutional strategy must address burnout as a systemic design flaw rather than an individual failure. Medical, corporate, and academic institutions must evolve to deliberately screen and actively train these non-cognitive buffers. By mapping the architecture of resilience, we establish emotional intelligence as a measurable and deployable safeguard against total systemic collapse.